Next Python TA training lesson. In this lesson, we'll be covering lists and data structures. And in the next lesson, we'll be learning more about data structures and dictionaries. Now, a very basic data structure in Python is a list. You can think of a list as a bucket of items, and it can contain any type of data you want. For example, I have my list as equal to 2, 3, 1, 45, and 321. This would be a list of integers. You can also have a list with multiple types of data. For example, you can have a list with integers, strings, floats, or any of the other data types we've learned. You can even have a list inside of a list, which we'll talk about more in the next lesson. Now, with lists, we have two crucial vocabulary words that we have to learn about. A list has an index, which we refer to the position of the items, and an actual element, which is the item inside of the list. For example, I can say that 45 is an element of my list. If I say that I want to find the 0th index, that would be 2. We'll be learning more about indexes and elements on the next slide. Take a look at the following table. I have all of my indexes outlined here, and all of my elements. Please notice that my index starts from 0 and not 1. So we say that in the 0th position, we have 2. In the first index, we have 3. In the second index, we have 1. Notice how this corresponds to my list. 2, 3, 1, hello, and 100. It is important that you understand the concepts of index and how they start counting at 0. This is what we call as zero-based indexing. We can actually access or take out items from our buckets. For example, I have a list called My Students, and I set that list equal to Daniel, Nicole, Emily, and Jake. I can refer to the elements inside of that list with square brackets. For example, if I say print My Students of 0, that'll print the first index, which is Daniel. If I say print My Students of 1, which is the first index, so the first position, that would be Nicole. Notice here again, we started at 0 and not 1. And My Students of 2 would be Emily, and My Students of 3 would be Jake. Let's take a look at some of the functions that we can use with lists. A function takes in an input and gives an output, but here a function will take in a method, which you'll learn about in the final few lessons. First of all, the first function that we have is print length of my list, or len. Len is short for length, and as you can guess, it prints the length of the list. Let's count how many elements are in my list. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And therefore, the length of my list would be 5. So if I print that, we would actually get 5 on our console. We can also add elements to our list, or we can even remove elements. In order to add an element to a list, we use the append function. As you can see here, I did my list append new. Let's see what happens if we do that. I'm going to be typing this code into my online Python compiler, and I will append new to my list. If I append new, think about what will happen. After I append new, I'll be printing my list to see what happens. As you can see, our original list was 2, 3, 1, hello, and 100, but after we appended new, the word new got added to the end by the append function. And as I've said before, we can also remove elements from the list. Let's see what happens if I use the pop function, which is another function to remove an element. If I say my list pop 3, it'll actually remove the third index. Notice how it's the third index and not the third element. We see that 2 is the 0th index, 3 is the first index, 1 is the second index, and hello is the third index. By popping the third index, what we're basically doing is we're going into our bucket of items and we're basically taking out that third index. So we get 2, 3, 1, and 100. Notice how hello was removed from our list. Instead of referring to the position of which you're going to remove, we can actually directly say which one we want to remove. We have my list as 231 hello and 100. And then let's try to remove the word hello. Let's try to remove 2 from the list. If I remove 2 and then print my list again, I'm going to get 3, 1, hello, and 100. Very simple, right? We can also sort the elements in a list. For example, let's say that I have a list that's a bunch of integers, let's say. Notice how all of these numbers are unsorted and very messy. If we use the dot sort function, what it's going to do is it's basically going to sort it in from the least to greatest. By running this code, we get 1, 2, 3, 21, 23, and 923. Notice how it sorted the numbers from least to greatest. All of these functions will be tested on the final exam. Please memorize all of these functions before taking the final exam. We can actually go through every element in a list and print them. Let's take a look at this following code. Think about what it'll do using the concept of for loops. I originally set my list equal to 2, 3, 1, hello, and 100. For each of the element in my list, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be going into my bucket and then printing that element. Let's see what this code does. It'll print every single element in that list. So elements, our variable here, will iterate through 2, 3, 1, hello, and 100. And then we're going to be printing every single element. There's another way that we can do this, and that's by using for I in range of length of my list. This code looks a bit more complicated, but don't worry. We can copy paste this in here. Think about what this code will do. And remember from lesson 3 what a for loop does. If we run this code, we get the same thing, 2, 3, 1, hello, and 100. Notice we have for I in range of the length of my list. And the length of my list was what? The length was 5 because we had 5 items inside of our list. So we're going to be repeating this 5 times. So for 5 times, we're going to be printing the ith index. And remember from our chart here, we can actually print it by putting a number inside the brackets. But the number inside the brackets doesn't necessarily have to be an integer. It can also be a variable. And that variable is what we can update. Let's see what happens if I print I, like that. For I in range of 5, print I. It'll print 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to wrap this around in that square bracket. And what that's going to do is we're going to be printing 2, 3, 1, hello, and 100. Let's take a look at some sample questions from the final exam. What will the following code do? Take a moment to pause the video here and think about this question. This code will actually sort all of the elements in Horseman, and then after we're done sorting it, we're going to print it. Notice how, again, it's from least to greatest. Let's take a look at the second question. To add an element to a list, you would use, that is right, the append function. Good work. Now, the final question of the day. What will the following code do? We have Horseman as a list of 1, 43, 1, 90, and 2. We set a counter variable equal to 0. For each of the elements in Horseman, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be using a conditional statement. If you don't know what a conditional statement is, please refer back to lesson 3. If the element is greater than 4, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be incrementing a counter or increasing a counter. Let's run this in our Python compiler to see what it actually does. Notice how it prints 2. I'm going to go back to my list and see how many elements are greater than 4. We can see that 43 and 90 are greater than 4, and that's why it printed 2, because there are 2 elements that are greater than 4. And the plus equal sign here is used for incrementation, as we discussed in the last lesson. That was it for today's lesson. I hope that you had lots of fun, and see you in the next one.